Focus.
Camera is on.
Good afternoon. After a pause of few months, here we are. We continue with our programs, and today we are very proud to announce that our guest is Kasai Baki Dear, a guy from New York who grew up in Bronx and who has a very rich history of being an activist. And today we're going to talk about black nationalism. Welcome, Kasai, to Caravanserai.
Thank you for having me, Gigi. It's a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure is ours. So, we actually figure out few issues we want to discuss in these 45 or 60 minutes, some key points of what is a black nationalism, the origins and how it built it up, and you're the one who's going to actually explain us a little bit about that. So you can start.
So yeah, great. Well, black nationalism started off in the wake of World War I. The father of it is considered Marcus Garvey, who was a Jamaican. And it was the first time since the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, the abolition of slavery, the colonization of Africa, that black people in the world started to become politically organized and socially organized. That had a lot of kind of cultural, social, and political ramifications. Why particularly after World War I? Well, World War I was important because it was the first time that not only black Americans, but black subjects of the British West Indies fought for their respective imperialist powers. And after centuries of being told that they were worthless, they had no contributions, they had no value or worth to society, well, it turned out that the black troops and African troops, West Indian troops, and black Americans actually won the war for the Allies. And particularly for black Americans, this was the first time they actually left the United States. They went to France and they experienced freedom. They didn't experience racial segregation. They were treated as equals by the white French population. The white French in particular viewed the black American soldiers as the heroes and the victors of World War I. And so what happened was that this completely changed the self-awareness and self-consciousness of black people. And this was the first time after more than 300 years of slavery that black people started to have actually a kind of a self-assertiveness. And that's its origins. It developed over the course of the century, and it developed into various reactionary, mystical movements from Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, the Moorish Science Temple, the Nation of Islam, and then by the 50s and 60s, it moved into a more serious revolutionary direction as a result of decolonization of Europe and of Africa and the Caribbean, and more of a development of sort of kind of various Marxist, communist, revolutionary ideas. And so that's kind of where its origins are, and later on it expanded into influence into literature, into music, and popular culture.
And then we will obviously talk a little bit about 80s, 90s, and even what's happening now.
That's correct.
All right, so we go back to Marcus Garvey. I'll first give my little impression. When I was young, I was buying the records in London, reggae records, and from Burning Spear, from Aswad, all those reggae bands, and Marcus Garvey was like a god. And I had the impression he's a very good man who actually was fighting for recognition of the rights of the black people in America, and he was later talking in a League of Nations and all of that stuff. Until I moved to New York, and then I had the various kind of conversation with black activists from left side saying, the Marcus Garvey wasn't that, like the whole story about him wasn't all good. There was some, like a dark sides of the Marcus Garvey. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, very much so. So Marcus Garvey was actually Jamaican. He wasn't an American. What was interesting about him was that what's most important about him is that he he traveled around the world because Jamaica was part of the British Empire. Unlike Black Americans who were mostly confined to America, Marcus Garvey traveled around the world, the British Empire. And he saw that no matter where in the world he went, Caribbean, North America, Africa, Europe, Asia, that Black people were at the bottom of society. And so that really, really affected him. Also, being a Jamaican, he was dark-skinned. And still to this day, in Jamaica and the Caribbean, there's still a lot of colorism amongst Black people. It used to be like that in the U.S. Until the 60s, but it's less now. But in Jamaica, it's still very powerful. So he had this kind of double inferiority complex of both being Black and being dark-skinned. However, he traveled to the United States, and what he was so impressed about was that he saw that Black people had businesses. They had a certain type of economic autonomy. Well, the reason why that was because of the unique nature of American segregation, this doctrine of separate but equal. So what happened, of course, if Blacks can't go to white hospitals, they have to set up their own hospitals. If Blacks can't go to white funeral homes, they have to set up their own funeral homes. If Blacks can't get loans from the banks, they have to set up their own banks. So what happened was that in the context of this doctrine of separate but equal, that was the only place in the world that Black people had their own sort of businesses and economic autonomy. So Marcus Garvey was completely mesmerized and fascinated by capitalism, and he saw this as the model for Black liberation. So his movement, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, wasn't really about the liberation of Black people. That was just this kind of his business model. But actually what it was about him kind of enriching himself and creating his own sort of Black capitalist empire, and basically exploiting the Black workers and Black working class. He was intelligent enough to understand the plight of Black people around the world. And so he was able to set up a newspaper, Negro World, that had an international circulation. And it was really the first time that you had a Black newspaper that really, really spoke the truth. Before that, in Jamaica and in the U.S., you had the Black press, but it was always very, very bourgeois, very capitalist, very assimilationist, very petty. And now he was writing a newspaper that kind of voiced resentment to the plight of Black people. However, he was a scammer, and he was a con artist, and he pretty much used the ignorance and the lack of education of many Black people. It was only 10% in the U.S. of Black people who really finished high school, who went to university, who got a degree. So he was focusing more and more on the masses of the Black poor working class, who were illiterate or semi-literate, and he used them and he manipulated them. He set up something called the Black Star Line, in which he had promised that he was going to repatriate Blacks from the Caribbean in the U.S. back to Africa. Took millions of dollars from Black people. They were expecting to actually to go back to Africa. So, for example, in Jamaica, about 5,000 Jamaicans sold that little possessions they had. They sold everything. They sold their houses, they sold all their possessions, gave all their money to Marcus Garvey for the Black Star Line. They waited at the docks, and the ship never arrived. He set up all these scams and charities, but he was just basically, it was all a money laundering operation. That's bad enough. But what was really, really the most problematic thing about Marcus Garvey was that he was collaborating with the Ku Klux Klan. Very much collaborating with the Ku Klux Klan. if you go to the website of the Ku Klux Klan, they actually have a special page devoted to Marcus Garvey. They call him the Black Moses. And the Ku Klux Klan to this day say, yes, we're in absolute agreement with Marcus Garvey, because the only thing they disagreed with was who was the superior race. And so Marcus Garvey said that the blacks were, and of course we know where the Klan stood. But why? But the question is, why would Marcus Garvey collaborate with the Klan? Well, the same reason why it's very related to Zionism and Theodor Herzl in Europe. Herzl in Europe also worked very closely with anti-Semites. For the same reason Garvey worked with the Ku Klux Klan. The idea was to create a state of racial terror and hardship, to the point that black people would say, yes, you know what, America doesn't want us. If we don't leave America, we're gonna get killed. In fact, right now, today is just a couple of weeks ago was the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre. I don't want to get too much into that, but it was one of the worst racial massacres. And so this was perfect for Marcus Garvey. And this was a propaganda coup for Marcus Garvey. Instead of denouncing the Tulsa Massacre, instead of saying, okay, you know, we have to arm ourselves, we have to organize, we have to do something about racial terror and violence, to the contrary, Marcus Garvey said, no, this is great. See, we have to leave. We have to leave America. So this is why Marcus Garvey collaborated with the Ku Klux Klan. And then later on, when in 35, when Mussolini invaded Abyssinia, Ethiopia, Marcus Garvey made a remarkable statement in which he claimed not only that he was a fascist, but actually black people are the original fascists. That fascism is actually a black invention, and that what Mussolini calling himself as a fascist is just another example of white people stealing and appropriating from black people and black culture. And sure, Marcus Garvey, if you see him, he was, you know, dressed up in a military uniform, and so he was he was a fascist, and he was a reactionary.
Anti-British.
He
supported kind of
well, yes,
Germans, right?
Well, he supported the Axis powers, and we can get to this later on when we talk about a bit of Rastafarianism. But yeah, you find that to this day that a lot of Rastafarians are actually pro-Axis powers. It's a lot of respect and admiration for Hitler, and why? Because it's true that Hitler actually destroyed the British Empire, and if it wasn't for the Axis powers, the British Empire wouldn't have broken, and it's very unlikely that Africa and the West Indies would have gained their independence. So it's very, very twisted.
Similar with the Shah in Persia, you know, he supported Axis powers because he was expecting they will actually get off the British chains.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's very geopolitical, but like it's clear with Marcus Garvey. But let's now a little bit move to Rastafarianism, because for me it's not clear enough. I witnessed myself that certain Rastas are very nationalistic, very into black supremacies and about Haile Selassie and Marcus Garvey, everything you just said, like supporting that kind of purity and leaning toward Christendom. And on the other hand, I met a lot of Rastas who were very kind of left-wing oriented, and who were preaching unity among the nations and races. So where that split started? You know?
So that split pretty much started again around the 50s and 60s, when you had the anti-colonial struggle really started to move into high gear, and also the influence of Marxism and socialism, and so you started to see a much more serious, a much more serious move towards black liberation, and also understanding that it's not just a white and black thing. It was also the idea, particularly in the 50s and 60s, that there was common cause with also called people of color around the world, South Asians, the Arabs. Algeria was very important.
Sure.
Support for the Vietnamese against their struggle against the French at first, and then later the Americans. Also, support for the People's Republic of China. So there was first there was a sort of international movement for solidarity of people of color around the world. Later on, when blacks started moving to Britain, and because Britain's very different from the United States, there's integration, and so you live with your neighbors, and so when you live with your neighbors and you have English and Scottish and Irish and South Asian, and you're all living in a social housing estate and the projects, and because Britain is more and more, first and foremost, a class society, there's a lot of racism in Britain, but it's not segregated. And so you start to see that's where the more progressive aspect of Rastafarianism, of being more sort of universalist, starts to take place. But then on the other hand, you still have this reactionary strain of black supremacy that's based on mysticism. And it's very interesting because I want to just touch on Haile Selassie, and while he was also a problematic figure as well. And you know, there's a big problem with black nationalism I see is that it's based a lot on ignorance. Mm-hmm. A lot of people are not aware that, you know, Marcus Garvey was collaborating with the Klan. Reason why Haile Selassie was first noted before the invasion of Abyssinia, most black people in the world didn't know of Haile Selassie. And then when they realized, oh, okay, here's an emperor of the only independent black country in the world. He's being attacked by white fascists. We have to support him, and so he became this kind of figure as a symbol of black independence and black leadership. Of course, what they didn't realize was that the Solomonic dynasty of Ethiopia, it was an empire. It was imperialist. It had slavery. It was a big play in the Indian slave trade. Slavery was not abolished until 1942. Haile Selassie did abolish slavery, but even within Ethiopia to this day, you still have a lot of ethnic discrimination. And in fact, the Shanaki, who were the darkest skinned, the ones who really called the blackest people in Ethiopia, were the ones that were not only enslaved, but they were the most oppressed. And so, Haile Selassie himself was not any sort of pro-black at all. And he was not at all really interested in the liberation of black people around the world. In fact, the Solomon dynasty made its accommodation to European colonialism and imperialism all around it, to the north, to the south, to the east. It made its accommodation. Never once did Abyssinia ever make any objections to the colonization of its neighbors. It never once made any objections to the transatlantic slave trade. So it's kind of paradoxical that Haile Selassie becomes this figure of black nationalist iconography, but he was not a friend or an ally for oppressed black people in Africa or around the world. And so it's the problem with black nationalism is that a lot of it's based on ignorance and kind of on mythology and mysticism.
And we are not going to talk for much longer about the Jamaican issues here because it's totally another ball game. I've been in Jamaica, or there like they had that division in between, even in in the music with some guys supported Manley, who was supposedly socialist, and the other guys were supporting the guy Edward Siega, who was CIA implant in 1980, and then there was a big split. And I remember somebody told me like the Rastas made a big mistake, supporting Castro, who was also problematic figure. We know that, and then America used that as a pretext for reaction for invading Grenada and stuff, saying, "Oh, we're not gonna let all these islands turning communist and stuff." I didn't have impression Jamaica or other islands. They're very communist mind. They have that idea in their minds. They don't want to turn into another Cuba. It was already paranoia, just to move in and tie up the loose ends, and from my point of view, like implement more of capitalism. So that that's obvious that the American England and other European powers wanted that part of the world, Caribbeans, to be capitalist, and they are. You go there, you need a lot of money if you want to have a fun and stuff. So now we go back to America, and then after the Second World War, like in America, obviously these liberal actions of the left wing parties, the New Left and stuff, they made a big influence on black liberation movements, like the Black Panthers,
Yes.
Black Liberation Army and stuff, and was the part of the Malcolm X in that.
Right. So actually, again, we go a little bit before or after World War One.
Right.
And the Russian Revolution had a big impact on black intellectuals. So already you started to see the first movement of black communists in the 20s. In the 30s, the Communist Party USA, the CPUSA, had huge impact on black people. 42% of the membership of the Communist Party USA was black. Just very quickly, because I'm going to get into, but it leads up to the militancy. So in 1936, the Communist Party had organized black workers in Birmingham, Alabama, and the Ku Klux Klan. So it all ties in, and so the Ku Klux Klan basically tried to intimidate the black communists, and what you had for a few weeks was that you actually had basically a mini war on the streets of Birmingham, Alabama, armed gun battles.
Sure.
And the black communists wiped out the KKK in Birmingham. This was, I see, is the break from the Marcus Garvey, the right-wing black nationalists. Because now it wasn't about making accommodation with the white supremacy. It wasn't being afraid of white supremacy. It was now directly challenging white supremacy and
What
defeating
year
it.
exactly?
That was 1936.
1936. Yeah, sure.
And
Yes,
so,
Alabama massacre. Okay.
So again, and in World War II, it's very important to highlight that the United States government pretty much had to beg black people to fight, because after World War I, when black people fought, there was not one step towards progress. And so the United States government was really terrified that they were gonna, that black people were gonna flat out refuse. So basically the United States government begged black people to fight. And they had to really ramp up the propaganda and show that Hitler and the Nazis were hardcore white supremacists. But it was only with great reluctance that black people fought. After World War II, this now sharpens the resolve, because now it's like, okay, this is the second time within 25 years we won the war for you, and now you're gonna have to change your tune. Also, with the rise of the Soviet Union, and now with the rise of the Cold War, and the U.S. state realizing that 42% of the members of the Communist Party are black, the Soviet Union had a lot of propaganda, anti-racist propaganda, and so you started to see moves by the U.S. state. So in 1948, President Truman desegregated the U.S. Army, the U.S. military. You actually start to see that segregation on interstate bus travel was actually outlawed in 1948, but it wasn't enforced until the 60s. So you started to see that now you had a younger generation of black people who were even more militant than the previous generation. And this is where the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X comes into play. So now you're starting to see now a militancy that's taking place. So you have the Nation of Islam. And on the other hand, you have the writers and intellectuals such as Richard Wright, Chester Himes, who, at least with the case of Richard Wright, he was actually a member of the Communist Party. Chester Himes actually fought, he didn't fight, but he was a little bit too old, but he actually worked in the shipyards in California for the naval effort. And now you're starting to see in literature a sharper key of anti-racist writing and thought. And so this is all now starting to come to a head, and this is where you start to see kind of the split. And then you have Elijah Muhammad of the Nation of Islam. And this was something that was very different from the communists, because now with the black communists, they're more rooted in kind of international solidarity, interracial unity, but now you have a militant strain that's now separatist and anti-white, and this absolutely astonishes and scares the United States. And Malcolm X comes off, he gets converted in prison, brilliant orator, and he starts organizing working class black people in New York, Chicago, Detroit, and he's stirring them up. And this time and it was interesting because it was a time of McCarthyism. And McCarthyism, what people fail to realize, that McCarthyism was first and foremost an anti-black racist movement. All of the first people persecuted were the black communists. It was only after they had attacked the black communists that they started to go after the whites. So the United States kind of shot itself in the foot. So they had neutralized the communists and kind of scared the black communists, but in its place came the black Muslims and the Nation of Islam, and then the rise of Malcolm X. And now,
sorry to stop you, but I'm not sure they shoot themselves in the foot, because they did it several times in other parts of the world, exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
So, if you make once mistake, then you can say, yeah, that was like mistake accidentally, but if you make like several times, then,
Sure.
There must be some ground plan for something like that.
Yeah, but when I say they made a mistake, because actually it created a more militancy which they didn't expect. And so, of course, the Nation of Islam is a strange cult and sect, which was actually a break off from the Moorish Science Temple of America, which was founded by a very strange guy named El Fard, that to this day no one really knows who he was or where he's from, whether he's from Afghanistan or he was a white American. No one really knows, and he was kind of selling Bibles. Very strange story. But anyway, Elijah Muhammad takes over, and again, the Nation of Islam, where the Communist Party was organizing the black working class, the Nation of Islam fills the vacuum. of organizing amongst the black working class, particularly the petty thieves, those in prison. And so Malcolm X comes along, and this is really the first time anyone, really even more than Marcus Garvey and even more than Paul Robeson or W.E.B. Du Bois or Richard Wright, who were previously considered to be too radical, but now Malcolm X is saying things that have never been said before. And there was always this before. There was always this, even with the black political struggle, not to be. It was always about being anti-racist, but now this is the first time you're starting to see a manifestation of anti-white sentiment. And this was something that was very new and very different, and it scared people. And of course, it was a great organizing tool, because it finally it gave vent and it gave voice to what almost every black person privately felt and privately thought, but would never dare utter in public.
Sure.
And so this led to militancy, and this led to Muhammad Ali, who again, maybe some people younger people don't remember, but he, again, you had black boxers who, because of racism, when they fought white boxers like Jack Johnson and Joe Louis, when they became champions, there was outrage by majority of white America. So sports figures had always, particularly in boxing, always had to kind of be very quiet and keep a low profile. But Cassius Clay joins the Nation of Islam, calls himself, changes his name to Muhammad Ali. He was mentored by Malcolm X. And now, so first it was Malcolm X, now it's Muhammad Ali, and now suddenly, now in the early 60s, now you're having black people speak with a boldness that had never ever happened before in the United States. And so, then of course there are the internal issues between Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad. Once again, we see the Nation of Islam in true Garveyite fashion. They were collaborating with the American Nazi Party. And so there were secret meetings between the Nation of Islam and the American Nazi Party. And Malcolm X was a party to these meetings, but it never sat right with him. He knew this was something that was really wrong. Also in 1961, the Los Angeles police attacked the Nation of Islam mosque in LA. And Malcolm X was furious, and he actually wanted to organize, but Elijah Muhammad was like, no, we can't do anything about it. So so Malcolm X was really, really torn, because on one hand, he's speaking this kind of this militancy and really trying to whip up a kind of radical militant organization against white supremacy, but the Nation of Islam was not interested in the final analysis of actually fighting and combating white supremacy, and that's what led to the split between Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad. Of course, Malcolm X goes abroad and he becomes an internationalist. And he no longer becomes a sort of anti-white. And this then opens up the space again for SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, led by Stokely Carmichael, later Kwame Ture, and then leading up to the Black Panther Party for self-defense. That was interesting because with Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam in the 50s and 60s, you still have this kind of schisms. So you've always had the schism within American black liberation between what you can call the nationalists, the separatists, and the integrationists, or then it became a kind of insult. And so it's just like But of course, people understood that black people, no more than 12% of the population, have no chance to rise up and in any sort of revolutionary way against the U.S. Government. And so it was like, okay, we have to live with white people. We have to make an accommodation with them. And so this was always a schism. And when Malcolm X, though he never really becomes an integrationist per se, but he stops being a sort of an anti-white militant, and he becomes an internationalist. And again, he starts to make common cause with um, the Arab liberation, African liberation, Asian liberation, and you start to see the internationalization. And this now led, for the first time, though starting in the 50s a bit, but now you start to see that black people no longer felt that they were alone. That now they had allies all over the world, and in fact, they started to realize, hey, so-called people of color, we are actually a majority. White people are a minority, so we organize internationally in solidarity, and that's why you find that the United Nations becomes very, very important for a lot of black revolutionary thought, because when all these nations started to get independence, now finally after centuries, black nations are now having a voice and a say in international affairs, and so the United Nations becomes a point of focus. And it's also kind of interesting on a side note why. Go.
And the guy, the main guy from with the Black Panthers, you know. Like,
Yeah, so there were three.
Yeah.
So it was Huey Newton,
Newton. Yeah.
Bobby Seale,
Yeah.
and Eldridge Cleaver.
They're all from Oakland.
They're all from Oakland.
California, right?
Yeah, and all educated.
Yeah.
So Huey Newton was a law student.
Right.
Bobby Seale was an engineer,
Yeah.
and Eldridge was just a common criminal. And so, again, they were this officially the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, and it was about against police brutality. And since California is the West and the Wild West, there was very little gun control. And so they organized what was called patrolling the pigs, and so they read the law books, and you could stand a few feet from the police and observe them, and so they started preventing black people from getting beat or killed or even arrested for no reason, and of course in 68, 67, 68, I forgot which year it was, but then they scared everyone because they then marched on to the California State House with armed, and they broke into the chamber. And
So ideologically, where they belonged?
so
Left or right?
they were definitely left.
Yeah.
They were definitely left. It took them a while to kind of, first they weren't really, when they were just starting off as a self-defense.
Sure.
They didn't really have any sort of ideological foundation.
The seal was in Algeria. Or
Yeah,
something.
exactly. But then exactly when he went to Algeria, and then they started to see that Mao Zedong, for his own strategic reasons, was supporting African liberation. They started to become Maoists. So by '69, the Panthers had become Maoists.
Sure. Newton was killed, right?
Yeah, Huey Newton was killed.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And the seal.
Seale's still around.
Still around.
He's
yeah.
still around. Bobby Seale's still around. Eldridge Cleaver, he was always, people had long suspected him as someone who wasn't really sincere. He wrote the #1 bestseller in 1968 called Soul on Ice.
I see.
And that was when you look at 1968, and this is the first time you can really see that black power really now has an influence on the wider white culture
Sure.
because everyone read Soul on Ice.
Yeah. To finish that era, we can with the Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. They were killed maybe a few months.
Yes.
1968, right?
1968. Yes.
And then from some reason I got those two murders connected.
Yeah.
You know, like that was the obviously the Martin Luther was going on some structure, the powerful structure they're going on their nerves. So what was his position?
So, what happened was that Martin Luther King, once the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, and then the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, he started to see some very troubling trends. So, for example, before 1964, the employment rate between white and black was equal. So you didn't have a gap between white and black unemployment. But starting in '64, after the civil rights legislation was passed, we started to see this gap. After the Voting Rights Act was passed in '65, this is where you started to see increase in what became what we now call the mass incarceration state.
Sure.
And so Martin Luther King started to see that, okay, this is more than just an issue of racism or just discrimination. And he started more and more to make a class analysis of it. Martin Luther King also discovered that racism was not just an issue in the southern states. 1967 was actually, he had his biggest defeat in of his activist time. He went to Chicago, and Chicago was up into the 90s was more segregated than Johannesburg, South Africa. This is one of the most rigidly segregated cities in the world to this day. Very, very racist city. And so he went to Chicago to agitate, and he was basically humiliated by Mayor Richard Daley. He went
Famous,
he went to, so Martin Luther King, his family moved into the West Side, and he made a press conference, said they haven't cleaned the streets, this is a disgrace. The next day, Daley sent in the sanitation department and tidied it up. And then he went to a western district of Chicago called Cicero, where they were resisting integration, and he got stoned in Cicero. And he basically discovered that, wow, facing down the white racists in Mississippi and Alabama was easier than in Chicago. And so he left Chicago defeated. He basically crossed the federal government with his speech in 1967 at Riverside Church, where he came out against the Vietnam War. And he said that the United States was the biggest purveyor of violence in the world. And that was pretty much when President Johnson was done. And that was pretty much, that was pretty much where his death warrant was signed. And he also, again, he started to take more of a class thing, and he was organizing a poor people's campaign, in which, again, he was trying to organize with poor white people.
So they became suspicious that he's a communist, right?
Yeah, so they always thought, they always believed that he was
Communist.
he was always a communist.
And then, okay, that's clear. And then 70s were problematic with the new left, who actually sold out and the whole revolution for 60s collapsed. And then we had the yippies and yappies. And then in 80s, when I was in America, the Father Farrakhan, the Nation of Islam all over again,
Yes.
redesigned. And so, how about him? Where what he was about, you know?
Well, yeah. So, he is implicated, and in the assassination of Malcolm X. And in many ways, he is indirectly responsible for it. And this is still
Interesting.
very controversial and very touchy. You talk today members of the Nation of Islam, and they don't want to deal with this. Spike Lee's film Malcolm X touches on this, and this really put Farrakhan really defensive. Because basically he in the Nation of Islam newspaper, they really demonized Malcolm X and pretty much called for his death. So he kind of faded. Then Elijah Muhammad died in 70, 75, 76. And then for the longest time, Louis Farrakhan was sort of a really, Nation of Islam was low-key. Couple reasons. First of all, you had the 70s, early 70s, you now had the Black Power movement, which had now become the Black Liberation Army. And now you were starting to have things like guerrilla warfare. And this was also made, they made connections to the American Indian movement, the AIM, Leonard Peltier, one of the biggest political prisoners in the world, the Puerto Rican independence movement as well. So you started to now see this convergence, but it was militarily defeated. George Jackson, the Soledad brothers, Angela Davis, of course Asada Shakur, she had to flee to Cuba. And so what had happened was that it went from, and what it was that after the assassination of Martin Luther King, this is when, and then Fred Hampton in '69, and of the Black Panthers in Chicago. And so many black people had said, okay, now protesting is not enough. We can't do the protesting. We can no longer appeal to the conscious, good white liberals of the government. Now we're going to have to take up arms. Also encouraged by the idea of Castroism and Che Guevara and this idea of kind of guerrilla uprising. So this is what really characterizes the 70s, early 70s. It was a sort of a paramilitary uprising.
Yeah, Betty Hearst and
Yes.
whatever that organization has a name. There was very similar to Bader Meinhof in Brigade.
I know. I know what you're talking. I can't remember the name.
Betty Hearst, the millionaire's daughter, who was kind of supposedly brainwashed. The 70s are dodgy, we know that. There was like a big confusion over there. But in 80s, before the yuppie revolution exploded in America in 90s, I've seen a lot of black people actually turning to consumerism and
what happened was that the 80s was the beginning of with the election of Reagan.
Right.
And so what you have to understand was that the late 70s, what you had in the United States because of the disco movement, and regardless of what you like disco music or not, what you have to remember about disco was that this was a deeply anti-black racist movement where you had records that were burnt. I mean, you had like the Nazi movement in Chicago. They actually had anti-disco riots. They would actually take 10,000 disco records after baseball games and blow them up. So what was the issue about disco? What it was that in the late 70s, and I remember this because I grew up, what had happened was that the country had become very much culturally black. Even white people, you look at photographs of Billy Joel, Billy Crystal, Barbra Streisand, even white people were having afros. They were having afros. The country, and what happens, a lot of the young people a lot of the new wavers in New York who had become radicalized in 1968, they had also embraced blackness culturally. And so what happened was that by 1980, and you have this periodic after World War I, 1980, and now you have it today in the U.S., this fear that the country was becoming black, culturally black. And so that's what the anti-disco movement was about. So Reagan comes in, basically on that backlash of anti-disco, but also the anti-civil rights movement. Very hostile. Reagan went to Philadelphia, Mississippi, where there had been a lot of lynchings in 1980. And he actually went to a white supremacist festival. And so what happened was, it was very clear that when Reagan was elected, that though they couldn't overturn civil rights legislation, now the government was now going to be very hostile to civil rights. And many of the hippies and the white hippies and the white radicals, by 1984, they had all become yuppies and they had all voted for Reagan. And you started to see that what Nixon started, interesting with Nixon was actually the first and only president that said he was for black power. And what's also problematic to the 70s is this is when you started getting all these black elected officials. So basically, almost every big city in the United States had black mayors. Cleveland started in '67, Chicago, LA in the '80s, Detroit, also Atlanta. So all the big cities had black mayors. And so there was this belief, we get black mayors, we get black politicians, things will get better. No, things didn't really get better. You had a sort of middle class elite who were able to get rich, but the bulk of the black people remained behind. And in the 80s, this is where this politics comes in, and this trend of consumerism and into electoral politics and the general conservative turn. No more militancy. No more. All the revolutionaries have been killed, or they're rotting in prison. Then you have the end of the Cold War. Berlin Wall comes down. Soviet Union is gone, and so now socialism, Marxism, is now discredited once and for all. We get to the 90s, and so after 15 years of reaction and conservatism, who fills in the void? Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam again. And then you had his guy who was actually a replacement. You know who Dr. Khalid Muhammad is? Yeah. So, and people thought he was going to be the next Malcolm X, and very much like Malcolm X, and somehow is even a bit more extreme in the rhetoric than even Malcolm X was. Right. Malcolm X was extreme in the rhetoric, but he himself was still very much a very kind of calm. His public persona was very different from who he was. He was always just a very, very mild-mannered personality. But Khalid Muhammad, he was what you saw is what you get, and so. And then with the thing is with George Bush Sr., again running on openly racist politics, '88 with Willie Horton ad, which basically said that a political ad in '88 against the Democrats, and the message was that if you elect the Democrats, black men are going to rape white women. Okay, and so you started again to get this open anti-black racism in the political discourse. 1991, David Duke, former leader of the Ku Klux Klan, in the first round of the election for Louisiana governor, gets 42% of the vote. And yes, and and then the following year, David Duke.
I live in America. Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yes, and then David Duke then decides to challenge George Bush Sr. for the nomination of Republican.
That's what we have here at the moment. We have a hardline that's always putting pressure on those who are supposedly centric, but they have swastika right here. This has a swastika right there. They have nothing to hide. They just put, they do the pressure, and that's it. So it's the same game everywhere, man. Same game
what happens? So then you had, and then Bill Clinton when he runs, and then Bill Clinton.
That's the guy who smoked but never inhaled.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Enough about him. We move to Obama.
Well, yeah,
We move to Obama
Yeah.
because I want to leave them
Okay,
time
yes,
for
this
some
is a
questions.
little bit- Okay, so anyway, but that's the 90s with Khalid Muhammad and Louis Farrakhan. So in this, after now 15 years of right-wing social movements and political trends, the Nation of Islam comes back, and that's what happens in the 90s. And it goes now back to conservative black nationalism, and no longer what you had in the 50s, 60s, and 70s of a more progressive internationalist. It now moves into right-wing black nationalism and separatism.
All right. And then right now, with the police brutality, I know you're not hanging in America that much, neither do I, but I was there a year and a half ago.
When I was there, actually, I was there, what it was 4 years ago.
Yeah, right.
Oh, wow.
You know, so
Yeah.
the things change very fast.
Yes.
All right, like I had, you know, that wasn't my America anymore, and you know, because I'm used to in America to talk openly about all the problems, and you know, like I like people to express themselves, but I felt people are like scared.
Yes.
They don't want to talk. Now intellectuals are very careful to express themselves.
Yeah, they are.
And you know, the black intellectuals, the white intellectuals, the Chinese intellectuals, they're all like backing up, and you know, you have these handbangers going around and shouting and you know, proclaiming a war on whites or war on blacks, and it's like a mess.
Yes.
You know, it's a mess. So how do you see what is going to happen?
Well, I think what happened that the events of September 11th, 2001, really shattered the 20th century political paradigms and dynamics. Now, after that, people really became afraid to speak out because the war on terror was launched, and you're either against us, or you're either with us, or you're with the terrorists. And so there was a big chill on dissent that pretty much erupted, that started since September 11th, 2001. Also, then you have 2007, 2008 financial crisis. And right now, you have a real existential angst that people have. Now, in many ways, it's worse than the Great Depression. People now are really just fighting for survival. And because people are fighting for survival, people are scared. I mean, people are afraid of, they're afraid of terrorists, they're afraid of the state, they're afraid of economic ruin. Now people are afraid of coronavirus. And so what's happened is that in this century, you see that people have pretty much are just in a state of fear, a lot of confusion, and people really do not know how to react to these challenges that are happening socially, politically. The culture has changed a lot because of social media and the internet, and so there's no longer you no longer have any real social activism. Now activism is all done through machines, whereas you don't have papers anymore. That was how Marcus Garvey, Nation of Islam, Black Panthers, all of these people, all this political organizing was through the print media and having meetings and mass meetings. And now in this 21st century of everything online, you don't have that anymore. You don't have, people do not socialize. People do not really have this, there's no more big spaces for people to have mass meetings to really talk and discuss. Now last year with social distancing, so it's very, very, very challenging for political activists, whether you're black or white. It's a very, very difficult time, and you're also finding that people are really they've just lost the plot. People have lost their minds. People have really, truly lost their minds. A lot of conspiracy theories are bound. People do not know what's left or right, what's up or down. It's very, very, very difficult, and I'm hoping that I really don't know what the solutions are. I think we should just have more meetings like this, where we actually can come and talk and share ideas and perspectives, and to be open about it. I think right now there's a lot of, I hate this word. I just use it, this term. I just use it, but there's a lot of like this quote unquote political correctness, where people are really afraid to express an opinion that someone else may dislike because it might offend them. And we cannot have a society where everyone's living in fear of being offended or causing offense. I mean, just imagine, Malcolm X or Muhammad Ali. I mean, people today would not be able to take
express
that.
themselves.
Yeah.
So, you guys, if you have any questions?
Thank you for this great presentation. You helped me a lot to understand some things from the different perspective. Actually, I have two questions. First is if you can say more about this mystical or religious part of the Rastafarianism, in the sense that if Marcus Garvey was Black Moses, then Emperor Haile Selassie was considered a god himself. And of course, from our culture and from today's points of view, it seems very exotic kind of belief. But if we understand more about the characteristics of this social and cultural context in which this kind of belief appeared, then it would not seem so strange to us, because we have situation that social and political context on one side and this religious context are not put in juxtaposition, but they are intermingled with each other. So, for example, Bob Marley was for me one of the most fascinating figures in the 20th century. But for him, when this reporter asked him, for example, about his dreadlocks, and he said, "This is my identity, man." And he starts his concert very often with this chants to Haile Selassie. So if you can say more about this.
Okay. So exactly. So what you have with Rastafarianism, and you also have another group, and I wanted to mention it, but I'm glad I get to it now, the Black Israelites. You probably haven't heard of them. They're quite powerful in the United States. What you have is that the belief that blacks in the Americas are actually the biblical Hebrews. They're the biblical Jews. And that's where this notion of Babylon comes from. They put they're likening the conditions of the last 400 years to that of the Jews. With Haile Selassie, because they claim to actually be that dynasty actually claims to be direct descendants of King David through King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. And so this is like, see, this is proof. We are actually the original we're original Israelites. We are the black people are the original Jews. And so you get this notion, and you get this kind of weird thing where you find that they say that European Jews, white Jews, aren't real Jews, and that they're stealing this identity, again, a racist cultural appropriation. And so where this comes from, religiously, this comes from the Baptist missionaries during the 18th century, who they were white British Protestants who really saw it was their mission to baptize and these heathens and make them into Christians and baptize them. And one of the ways they did it was to try to say, oh, look, your condition as slaves is very much like just like the biblical Israelites. And so, but don't worry, if you are faithful to God, you're faithful to Jesus, you will be delivered out of bondage, out of slavery, just as the biblical Jews were. So that's where it comes from. The root. That's where it historically comes from. So as the centuries goes on, and then the Rastafarianism, it kind of mutates into the thing where, oh no, this isn't just a metaphor. No, we are the true descendants. So it's not just a kind of allegory. It becomes we are the true
Literal,
descendants,
yeah.
the literal descendants of the biblical Israelites, and also again related to Zionism. And you see all this thing about references to Zion and the Lion of Judah and all these things. But it's this kind of mysticism where they actually really believe that they are literally the descendants of the Jews from the biblical Jews. On the other side, you get something very, very completely different, where you have in the United States, not so much in the West Indies, but in the United States you have what's called the Kemetism. So Kemet was the original name of ancient Egypt. And so you now have this very strong in the United States, particularly in Atlanta, of this belief in this Egyptology, and that it was actually that black people in the Americas are actually the descendants of the ancient Egyptians, and so it's just like, see, we had a great empire. We had an empire. We were the most advanced civilization in the world. So it's very strange that on one hand you get the sort of the black Zionist Rastafarians who see themselves as the Jews who were enslaved by Egypt, but another side of black nationalism is like, no, we were the Egyptians. And so you get all, and it's a complete mysticism. It gets really mythical in this mysticism, and you group with the black Nubians, and it gets into the thing where they say that they're aliens and that they're from the planet Sirius, and that they were the gods from space that created Egypt and built the pyramid. So you get all of these very strange, out of really, really loopy things. And so, but the question is for me, as more of a kind of materialist, it's like, well, make up your mind. Are you the Israelite slaves, or are you the Egyptian slave masters? And let's even just say, let's just play make believe. Even if we are the descendants of ancient Egyptians. Well, I wouldn't be so proud of that, because first of all, that was the slave society, as all civilizations were. And you really want to say, yeah, well, we were the masters and we had slaves. And also very likely, even if you claim that you were a descendant from ancient Egypt and that you built the pyramids, well, it's very likely that you were slaves that built the pyramids. But this is something that they don't want to address. And that's why I call it this mysticism and this mythology. And so you see it in all these various right-wing strands of black nationalism, of Rastafarianism, and then we're the black Israelites about being the biblical Jews, and then the black Kemalites who claim they're the ancient descendants of the ancient Egyptians. So there's a lot of mysticism and mythology that's in black nationalist thought.
You have a question?
Yeah, I'm thinking I'm having like a parallel tracks, right? So I'm curious, like when you're saying mysticism, I'm just thinking about black women healing that is happening, and it's all around now, healing mysticism, go back to the roots, So then how do you see that from your perspective? Yeah, me working with the different social justice movements, and black women healing justice movements, right now. There is a lot of, it can be a buzzword as well, right? Like, so it's like there is a lot of healing, mysticism, we go back to the roots, white people appropriated all of our culture, all of our healing practices, all of our whatevers, right? Which is true, yeah? And then there is a lot of like how we put it in a political context, it's our feminist political context, yes? This is one. And then second, you mentioned a lot of dudes get it, right? Like in this, but then like where is the role of black women, for like in a historical context as much as right? And their role, yeah, and the role in what you were talking about, not only black nationalism, right? But about like really like how that connects, yeah? How you are connecting the dots, from your perspective, right?
Very good question. Very, very good question. So the thing is that there's like most of the 20th century political movements, there was a lot of exclusion of women.
Absolutely, yeah.
Very patriarchal, indeed. But yet you find that there's still this worship of the black woman at the same time. It doesn't come out so much in the sort of public discourse, but in private, there's a thing about the black womb.
Matriarch.
Yeah. The black womb, how important it is to respect the black woman, the African queen, looking for your African queen and things. But still, you still see that it still keeps women in this subordinate role as mothers and as wives and as taking care of the children and like that. As far as the more radicals, you have Zora Neale Thurston. Yeah, she was probably perhaps in the early 20th century the most prominent black woman who was in the Harlem Renaissance. You find that in the Harlem Renaissance there was a lot more women that were involved in it, but you find that black women, their role for the most part was, if they had any impact, it was kind of kept within a realm of culture. So writers, musicians, Nina Simone.
Yeah.
Okay, Nina Simone, and so that was kind of the space that was really allowed for black women, was in the arts and letters and music.
Yeah. Not in the front lines of political struggle.
Though it came again a bit in the Black
A little
Panthers.
bit, yeah.
Again with the Black Panthers with Assata Shakur. Right. I don't know if you should read her memoirs, Assata, and she kind of comes to this realization that that the men of the Black Panthers were just pretty much, she says, talks a lot about this sort of macho-ness, but they really weren't thinking about security, whereas the black women, who were always very much more aware about security for the movement, but the black men were like, no, we got to take care of. As far as the more contemporary trends about black feminist healing, I really don't know so much about that. But actually,
for me, just like what's inspired me is like your question around like mysticism. But for me, just like what's contemporary, because this is what's happening. Is really like a lot of getting back to the black power of healing, of regenerating the movements.
Actually, I forgot about. I have something to talk about. So you have what those thing goes back to this. So there's a form of spirituality that was called hoodoo, which is it's an American variant of voodoo. We're very different. And all of the practitioners of hoodoo were black women. And so you find that, and prior to World War II, that was the big role of the big social role of black women, and how their role they played in the community was in this hoodoo. And so, kind of kind of paganism, kind of witchery. And it's interesting that that's coming back, because it was, it pretty much got lost after World War II. And the reason why was because with women, everywhere they started moving into the workforce. And so they started moving into the workforce and becoming part of the working class. And so a lot of that more traditional kind of paganism. But yeah, it's interesting that it's coming back. But yeah, that's where it comes from. It comes from this thing of hoodoo, and so yeah, and they had a lot of successful businesses, and they would particularly places like New Orleans and Texas, and it was interesting. I just read about 10, 15 years ago. I read I think it was a Black Gender Report about hoodoo, and I was not so much aware of that. But I know a little bit about that. But thank you for bringing it up, because that's a line of inquiry I should actually get more into, because I'm not so.
Yeah, I also think it's like in terms of like what you were saying, when you talk about like all kind of different revolution, like the blacks for liberation, right? And I think that like that there is a place for a lot of women in that history, but it's not there, right?
Yeah.
Like and then their role is like just in caretaking, taking care of these dudes who are on the front lines, right? So and I think like how is that possible? Because I met so many this incredible activists, right? Like on the front lines, who are coming from the like lines of generations of like family activists, like really radical, progressive, like from all over the U.S., right? I'm like, why we don't know about them?
As a matter of fact, after our discussion tonight on our program, we have American Art of 20th Century, and tonight, by coincidentally, is Maya Deren, American. She was a Russian Jewish who moved to America and became very famous experimental film maker, and she actually made the move to Haiti to study voodoo, and she made an amazing anthropological document about it. And then she's also related to American feminist movement because of her creativity, art, and everything.
She's
So
connected to Eastern Serbia, and
yeah, but what I'm trying to say that there were a lot of white women, being like Gertrude Stein. I can name many of them who were actually very keen to learn about particularly black culture in surrounding countries, Haiti, Jamaica, and then they actually fused that with the emancipation of the white American woman who was supposed to sit at home, cook dinner, lunch, and wait for a husband who's making money, so they put their kids in the university to be the next step class, and like that. So they those women, and same with the jazz scene in bebop and stuff in Minton's and Harlem. The white guys who they were, most of them were scared to go and fuse with these bebop guys and the Minton Harlem and stuff. So when the producers realize, how that is progressive and good, they move everything to 57th Street, where the top money was that. And there are a lot of elements we can actually, we can conclude that the whites were actually taking, not just from the blacks, from Indian country. Hey,
one of the things that I'm really thinking when you were talking about, like how black people disrupt the white comfort, right? Like then it's like white supremacy, and then suddenly you know, I'm aware you're the only black person among all us whites sitting here, you know, and then I'm thinking like, how is that the same? Like, which is now I think that like I have this huge interest in like somatic abolitionism, right? Like, so white people get your shit together and like understand, you know, I never historically, you know, created, understood, right? Like this disruption, you know, and how racism operates, and especially here, right? Like it's also a particular context, right? And also wondering how you find yourself a lot in white spaces, and how is that for you? That is this just like not educational?
Well,
like,
yeah. So,
how is that for your body?
well, it's very strange. I have. I'm glad you asked. You're asking very, very pertinent questions. Um, I'm a heretic because I'm really. I mean, I can maybe count the number on the one hand of other black political activists I know today who are not critical of Marcus Garvey. I have absolutely no respect for him. Absolutely no respect. Working with the Klan, cheating, scamming, people, I can't deal with that. I can't deal with that at all. But if I say this to more, particularly in North America, to contemporary black political activists, they will react very negatively, very hostile to me. When I'm also one of the last few. I mean, I'm a sort of not a non-aligned independent communist, and I've traveled. I've lived in 9 countries, and I speak. I'm polyglot. I speak 4 languages, and so when I go back to when I try to interact and organize with black people politically and socially, I mean, I'm an alien to them. They don't trust me. They don't trust me. I went back in 2014. I wanted to work with some black revolutionary anarchists, and they rejected me because they thought I was an agent. My class background, coming from my upper middle class background, and even when the few years I lived in the Bronx, I even lived in the wealthier parts of the Bronx, you know. And with my own education background, going to elite private schools, even going to public schools. My mostly raised by my grandmother, and so I was always very much kind of always going to these. I went to an elite Episcopal church. I used to go to the summer camps with the children of the old Yankee bourgeois white people, right?
Yeah.
So that's the thing. But at the same time, I never had. My family always kept me aware of reality, and so this was very strange. Though, and despite my activism with going back to 1991, confronting David Duke and fighting for abortion rights and reproductive rights, helping organize helping organize national demonstrations in DC for women's lives and for gay and lesbian things. And my activism, and it's very frustrating because despite all of my political activism and that the research I've done into black history and black culture, and so I've written a screenplay, and one of the things is where the character from New York goes to Gabon, and he actually takes ibogaine, which is a plant, and he has this hallucination. He actually meets Oromo, the Yoruban god of creation, and so when I try to present this to black literary people, they couldn't take it. Even though, despite this Afrocentrism, and But for me, I'm not superficial about it. If I'm going to get into African roots and African culture, it's not just about kente cloth. It's not just about speaking Swahili.
Yes.
It's not a
Yes.
superficial thing. I go into it very deeply. So unfortunately, I am rejected.
I'm sorry to hear that.
I am rejected. And so,
Yeah.
in a strange way, the only people who mostly will accept me are left-wing white progressives. It was incredible. I was invited to Oakland by these black anarchists who basically kicked me out on the street. And the only reason why I did not end up, really completely screwed was because of, white progressives in San Francisco that took me in. So it's very strange. I'm always it's very hard on the head.
Yes.
Let me just tell you this.
Yeah.
It's very, very hard on the head for me to be
Yes.
rejected by my people, be more accepted by whites, but still have this white supremacy to deal with. It's very,
Every day.
very, very, very hard on the head.
It's fucked up.
And but
Yeah.
I have to. Life goes on, and I have to.
Yeah.
Only thing I can do is to be honest and to tell the
Yeah.
truth
Yeah.
and to just analyze reality as it happens. Here it's just strange because about Serbia, and Gigi will probably be able to confirm this, maybe not, but it's very strange. Particularly, Serbs are in many ways a lot like Black Americans, and kind of mentality and culture. Sometimes it's really, really, really weird for me. And at first I thought it was just me saying that, and then I met other black people from New York
Yeah.
who came to Belgrade and like, yeah, the Serbs are a lot like black people.
See, I heard
It's-
everything about it, but never this.
Yeah, it's a very strange thing. And you find that also a lot of Serbs and Yugoslavs, particularly the older ones, when they went to the U.S., I've lost count of how many Serbs I know who went to the U.S. and had black spouses.
Mm.
Uh-huh.
A lot.
I know a few.
Yeah.
I lived in Harlem for 1 year,
Yeah.
Mm.
and I didn't feel alienated at all. As a matter of fact, I remember my first year in America, in Harlem, Spanish Harlem, one of the most colorful and most soulful experiences in my life. And since then, I had links with the black population on Jamaicans, Brooklyn, black Americans, black British. I had no problem ever. I had other problems. My people rejected me, and then the blacks accepted me.
Yeah.
So it's weird, but that's the way it is, and
the way it
that's
is.
why you have that experience, and you can tell. And one day when you transfer to other plane, like San Ra, you'll have like the weight, like you won't be just nobody who's just lived and didn't experience anything. Like the first, most of the people, racial issues are not issues. They don't care. They live in the bubble. Like they, like what are we gonna do? We gonna rise against who? Like another population? I don't think so. This is much cruel as we are. Like we can only rise against the Moloch of techno. Like with all these multi-billionaires who are, fucking us up and
Exactly,
sucking us up. It's my Rasta friend from Jamaica said, like before they would put a chain on your leg. Now they put a chain on your pocket, my friend. And that's the way it is. That the people don't want to realize that, and they tend to jump in the conclusion that somebody who has a different color of the skin or religion or background is the cause of his problems or her problem. No, we know where the problem is. Up above. So he wants to ask another question.
I was interested about the relation between today Black Power movement and the legacy of the 60s, and I think it is also connected with this what you are speaking about. In 60s, on one side we had Martin Luther King and his idea of peaceful demonstration and Gandhi as a role model, and basically his idea was integration, but that we have same rights with the major society and white people. completely opposite, I would say, in this specter, were Black Panthers who were ready for gunfight if it is needful, and they were chanting this revolution has started, time to pick up the guns. I would not say that their idea was separation, but the idea to have the nation inside of the nation was not, I think, so far of their perspective. And Malcolm X, I think that we can say that he was somehow in the middle of this, because in the first period, in 1964 or 5, he said something like completely in the opposition to Martin Luther King, who had this religious background. If white man slapped me on one side, I would not turn the other side. I would slap him back in this way that he would never slap me again. But after his pilgrimage to Mecca, he was somehow changed his perspective, and he was more for peaceful coexistence, if it is possible, with black brothers, because of this nation of Islam and these ideas. So I was interested today Black Power movement because they have influences of all these different perspectives. What would you say? What kind of influence is most prominent in this?
Oh wow, the most prominent. Well, definitely, I would say the most prominent influence that remain to this day is Black Pride, which really before '67 we didn't have that. There was still a lot of shame, guilt, and self-hatred. It's still there. We found all oppressed people, but what has changed forever is the sense of a sense of a pride, self-esteem, and that's here to stay. And I think that's the most of all of that. Even Martin had that, Malcolm X had that, Huey had that. They all had that.
Yeah.
They all had that thing of pride and being proud to be black. There's nothing wrong with that. Remember, we are the descendants of slaves. We are captives. It's not our fault. We didn't do anything wrong. We are human beings. We have accomplishments. We have much to contribute to the world. We have contributed a lot to the world. That's the biggest impact.
But I think to humanize, to humanize, like it was as if they humanized for 500 years, right?
Yeah,
So,
and that's the biggest impact that the '60s has left to this day.
Yeah, actually, this today political correctness, this Afro-American term, the idea for this was Malcolm X actually, but in the '60s, in the context of counterculture, the black was not wrong word. On the opposite, it was like, here is my black brother, and exactly what you're saying, that this pride actually about the blackness. Yeah.
Did you actually think why after the pilgrimage to Mecca, why he actually softened down? I think I have an answer. Do you know?
Well, according to what he wrote in his autobiography,
Right.
was that he saw white people praying
White people together.
and Asian people praying together.
Yeah.
And that he
Under
saw
the same God.
that,
Yeah.
and he said that when he was at Mecca, when people said that they were white, it was just a way to it's just a way to describe what the skin color compared to the U.S., where it was a badge of superiority, and so that's according to his autobiography.
That's why the white supremacists now are turning the focus on Islam because Islam reminds them of communism. But Islam and communism not.
Deflecting
Yeah.
deflecting from.
So because
you know.
Islam has that the magic to actually get everybody, regardless of the color of the skin, or social status, while the white supremacists love all Christians to be white with some, patches of, like other skin, but like the Holy Cross. And that's like a super league in football. It's a super league for them. Everything is reserved for them, even the outrageous genocides and stuff. And then Islam is coming there. I don't say like everything in Islam is great, because they also propose if you are not Muslim, then you shouldn't be there. They accept everybody, but you need to be a Muslim. I think it needs to come something which accepts everybody, regardless of the religious skin or education, and it's still not there.
Yes.
So we have a lower leagues, like all these guys who are like, these guys who are proclaiming racism in Africa, they're like a lower league compared to the premiership where the white supremacists are, and with their Christendom, which created so much problems. The Christianity obviously is not the same in their eyes what was supposed to be like 2,000 years with the early fathers who were proclaiming love and peace, but it's all diverted now into some very racist and like suprematist religion. So that's what I think.
Great.
Here we are. So any more questions? That's it. We wrap it up. We thank our guests for this great debate. And I wish you'll have many more around the world, and in Belgrade at least.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you.